Chapter 9. The Rate of Surplus Value. Section 1. The Degree of Exploitation of Labor Power. The surplus value generated in the production process by C, the capital advanced, i.e. the valorization of the value of the capital C, presents itself to us first as the amount by which the value of the product exceeds the value of its constituent elements. The capital C is made up of two components. One, the sum of money, small c, laid out on means of production, and the other being the sum of money V expended on labor power. Small c represents the portion of value which has been turned into constant capital, V that turned into variable capital. At the beginning then, C is equal to small c plus V. For example, if 500 pounds is the capital advanced, its components may be such that the 500 pounds is equal to 410 pounds constant plus 90 pounds variable capital. When the process of production is finished, we get a commodity whose value is equal to small c plus V plus S, where S is the surplus value. Or, taking our former figures, the value of this commodity is 410 pounds constant plus 90 pounds variable plus 90 pounds surplus. The original capital has now changed from C to C prime, from 500 pounds to 590 pounds. The difference is S, or a surplus value of 90 pounds. Since the value of the constituent elements of the product is equal to the value of the capital advanced, it is a mere tautology to say that the excess of the value of the product over the value of its constituent elements is equal to the valorization of the value of the capital advanced, or to the surplus value produced. Nevertheless, we must examine this tautology a little more closely. The equation being made is between the value of the product and the value of its constituents consumed in the process of production. Now we have seen how that portion of the constant capital which consists of the instruments of labor transfers to the product only a fraction of its value, while the remainder of that value continues in its old form of existence. Since this remainder plays no part in the formation of value, we may at present leave it on one side. To introduce it into the calculation would make no difference. For instance, taking our former example, small c equals 410 pounds, assume that this sum consists of 312 pounds value of raw material, 44 pounds value of auxiliary material, and 54 pounds value of the machinery worn away in the process, and assume that the total value of the machinery employed is 1,054 pounds. Out of this latter sum, then, we reckon as advanced, for the purpose of turning out the product, the sum of 54 pounds alone, which the machinery loses by wear and tear while performing its function, and therefore parts with to the product. Now, if we also reckoned the remaining 1,000 pounds, which continues to exist in its old form in the machinery, as transferred to the product, we would also have to reckon it as part of the value advanced, and thus make it appear on both sides of the calculation. We should, in this way, get 1,500 pounds on one side and 1,590 pounds on the other. The difference between these two sums, or the surplus value, would still be 90 pounds. When we refer, therefore, to constant capital advanced for the production of value, we always mean the value of the means of production actually consumed in the course of production, unless the context demonstrates the reverse. This being so, let us return to the formula C is equal to small c plus V, which we saw was transformed into C prime is equal to small c plus V plus S, C becoming C prime. We know that the value of the constant capital is transferred to the product and merely reappears in it. The new value actually created in the process, the value product, is therefore not the same as the value of the product. It is not, as it would at first sight appear, small c plus V plus S, or 410 pounds constant plus 90 pounds variable plus 90 pounds surplus, but rather V plus S, or 90 pounds variable plus 90 pounds surplus. In other words, not 590 pounds, but 180 pounds. If small c, the constant capital, were equal to 0, in other words, if there were branches of industry in which the capitalist could dispense with all the means of production made by previous labor, whether raw material, auxiliary material, or instruments, employing only labor power and material supplied by nature, if that were the case, there would be no constant capital to transfer to the product. This component of the value of the product, i.e. the amount of new value created, or the value produced, which contains 90 pounds of surplus value, would remain just as great as if small c represented the highest value imaginable. We should have C is equal to 0 plus V, equaling V, and C prime, the valorized capital, equal to V plus S, and therefore C prime minus C is equal to S, as before. On the other hand, if S is equal to 0, in other words, if the labor power whose value is advanced in the form of variable capital were to produce only its equivalent, we should have C is equal to small c plus V, and C prime, being the value of the product, would be equal to small c plus v plus 0. Hence, C would be equal to C prime. In this case, the capital advanced would not have valorized its value. From what has gone before, we know that surplus value is purely the result of an alteration in the value of V, of that part of the capital which was converted into labor power. Consequently, V plus S is equal to V plus delta V, V plus an increment of V. But the fact that it is V alone that varies, and the conditions of that variation, are obscured by the circumstance that in consequence of the increase in the variable component of the capital, there is also an increase in the sum total of the capital advanced. It was originally £500 and becomes £590. Therefore, in order that our investigation may lead to accurate results, we must make abstraction from that portion of the value of the product in which constant capital alone appears, and thus posit the constant capital as 0, or make small c equal to 0. This is merely an application of a mathematical rule, employed whenever we operate with constant and variable magnitudes, related to each other only by the symbols of addition and subtraction. A further difficulty is caused by the original form of the variable capital. In our example, C prime is equal to £410 constant, plus £90 variable, plus £90 surplus. But £90 is a given, and therefore a constant quantity, and hence it appears absurd to treat it as variable. In fact, however, the £90 variable is here merely a symbol for the process undergone by this value. The portion of the capital invested in the purchase of labor power is a definite quantity of objectified labor, a constant value like the value of the labor power purchased. But in the process of production, the place of the £90 is taken by labor power which sets itself in motion. Dead labor is replaced by living labor, something stagnant by something flowing, a constant by a variable. The result is a reproduction of V plus an increment of V. From the point of view of capitalist production, therefore, the whole process appears as the independent motion of what was originally constant value but has now been transformed into labor power. Both the process and its result are ascribed to this independent motion of value. If, therefore, such expressions as £90 variable capital or such and such a quantity of self-valorizing value appear to contain contradictions, this is only because they express a contradiction immanent in capitalist production. At first sight, it appears strange to equate the constant capital to 0, but we do this every day. If, for example, we want to calculate the amount of profit gained by England from the cotton industry, we first of all deduct the sums paid for cotton to the United States, India, Egypt, and various other countries, i.e. we posit the value of the capital that merely reappears in the value of the product as a 0 magnitude. Of course, the ratio of surplus value not only to that portion of the capital from which it directly arises, and whose change in value it represents, but also to the sum total of the capital advanced, is economically of very great importance. We shall therefore deal exhaustively with this ratio in our third book. In order to enable one portion of capital to realize its value by being converted into labor power, it is necessary that another portion be converted into means of production. In order that variable capital may perform its function, constant capital must be advanced to an adequate proportion, the proportion appropriate to the special technical conditions of each labor process. However, the fact that retorts and other vessels are necessary to a chemical process does not prevent the chemist from ignoring them when he undertakes his analysis of the results. If we look at the creation and the alteration of value for themselves, i.e. in their pure form, then the means of production, this physical shape taken on by constant capital, provides only the material in which fluid, value-creating labor power has to be incorporated. Neither the nature nor the value of this material is of any importance. All that is needed is a sufficient supply of material to absorb the labor expended in the process of production. That supply once given, the material may rise or fall in value, or even be without any value in itself, like the land and the sea, but this will have no influence on the creation of value, or on the variation in the quantity of value. In the first place, therefore, we equate the constant part of capital with 0. The capital advanced is consequently reduced from small c plus v to v, and instead of the value of the product, small c plus v plus s, we now have the value produced being v plus s. Given that the new value produced is equal to £180, a sum which consequently represents the whole of the labor expended during the process, if we subtract £90 from it, being the value of the variable capital, we have £90 left, the amount of the surplus value. This sum of £90, or S, expresses the absolute quantity of surplus value produced. The relative quantity produced, or the ratio in which the variable capital has valorized its value, is plainly determined by the ratio of the surplus value to the variable capital, and expressed by S over V. In our example, this ratio is 90 over 90, or 100%. This relative increase in the value of the variable capital, or the relative magnitude of the surplus value, is called here the rate of surplus value. We have seen that the worker, during one part of the labor process, produces only the value of his labor power, i.e. the value of his means of subsistence. Since his work forms a part of a system based on the social division of labor, he does not directly produce his own means of subsistence. Instead of this, he produces a particular commodity, yarn for example, with a value equal to the value of his means of subsistence, or of the money for it. The part of his day's labor devoted to this purpose will be greater or less in proportion to the value of his average daily requirements, or what amounts to the same thing in proportion to the labor time required on average to produce them. If the value of his daily means of subsistence represents an average of 6 hours objectified labor, the worker must work an average of 6 hours to produce that value. If instead of working for the capitalist, he worked independently, on his own account, he would, other things being equal, still be obliged to work for the same number of hours in order to produce the value of his labor power, and thereby to gain the means of subsistence necessary for his own preservation or continued reproduction. But as we have seen, during that part of his day's labor in which he produces the value of his labor power, say 3 shillings, he produces only an equivalent for the value of his labor power already advanced by the capitalist. The new value created only replaces the variable capital advanced. It is owing to this fact that the production of the new value of 3 shillings has the appearance of a mere reproduction. I call the portion of the working day during which this reproduction takes place necessary labor time, and the labor expended during that time necessary labor. Necessary for the worker because independent of the particular social form of his labor, necessary for capital and the capitalist world because the continued existence of the worker is the basis of that world. During the second period of the labor process, that in which his labor is no longer necessary labor, the worker does indeed expend labor power. He does work, but his labor is no longer necessary labor, and he creates no value for himself. He creates surplus value, which, for the capitalist, has all the charms of something created out of nothing. This part of the working day I call surplus labor time, and to the labor expended during that time I give the name of surplus labor. It is just as important for a correct understanding of surplus value to conceive it as merely a congealed quantity of surplus labor time as nothing but objectified surplus labor as it is for a proper comprehension of value in general to conceive it as merely a congealed quantity of so many hours of labor, as nothing but objectified labor. What distinguishes the various economic formations of society, the distinction between, for example, a society based on slave labor and a society based on wage labor, is the form in which this surplus labor is in each case extorted from the immediate producer, the worker. Since, on the one hand, the variable capital and the labor purchased by that capital are equal in value, and the value of this labor power determines the necessary part of the working day, and since, on the other hand, the surplus value is determined by the surplus part of the working day, it follows that surplus value is in the same ratio to variable capital as surplus labor is to necessary labor. In other words, the rate of surplus value, S over V, is equal to surplus labor over necessary labor. Both ratios, S over V and surplus over necessary, express the same thing in different ways, in the one case in the form of objectified labor, and the other in the form of living fluid labor. The rate of surplus value is therefore an exact expression for the degree of exploitation of labor power by capital, or of the worker by the capitalist. We assumed in our example that the value of the product is equal to 410 pounds constant, plus 90 pounds variable, plus 90 pounds surplus, and that the capital advanced is equal to 500 pounds. Since the surplus value is equal to 90 pounds, and the capital advanced is equal to 500, we should, according to the usual way of reckoning, get 18% as the rate of surplus value, because it is generally confused with the rate of profit. A rate so low it might well cause a pleasant surprise to Mr. Carey and other harmonizers. But in fact, the rate of surplus value is not equal to S over C, or S over small c plus V, but to S over V. Thus it is not 90 over 500, but 90 over 90, being 100%, which is more than 5 times the apparent degree of exploitation. Although, in the case we have supposed, we do not know the actual length of the working day, or the duration in days and weeks of the labor process, or the number of workers set in motion simultaneously by the variable capital of 90 pounds. The rate of surplus value S over V accurately discloses to us, by means of its equivalent expression surplus labor over necessary labor, the relation between the two parts of the working day. This relation is here one of equality, being 100%. Hence, the worker, in our example, works one half of the day for himself, the other half for the capitalist. The method of calculating the rate of surplus value is therefore, in brief, as follows. we take the total value of the product and posit the constant capital which merely reappears in it as equal to 0. What remains is the only value that has actually been created in the process of producing the commodity. If the amount of surplus value is given, we have only to deduct it from this remainder to find the variable capital, and vice versa if the latter is given and we need to find the surplus value. If both are given, we have only to perform the concluding operation, namely, calculate S over V, the ratio of the surplus value to the variable capital. Simple as the method is, it may not be amiss, by means of a few examples, to exercise the reader in the application of the novel principles underlying it. First, we will take the case of a spinning mill containing 10,000 mule spindles, spinning number 32 yarn from American cotton, and producing 1 pound of yarn weekly per spindle. We assume the waste to be 6%. Accordingly, 10,600 pounds of cotton are consumed weekly, of which 600 pounds go to waste. The price of the cotton in April 1871 was 7 3/4 pence per pound. The raw material, therefore, cost approximately 342 pounds. The 10,000 spindles, including machinery for preparation and motive power, cost, we will assume, 1 pound per spindle, amounting to a total of 10,000 pounds. Depreciation we put at 10%, or 1,000 pounds a year, being 20 pounds a week. The rent of the building we suppose to be 300 pounds a year, or 6 pounds a week. The amount of coal consumed, for 100 HP indicated at 4 pounds of coal per horsepower per hour during 60 hours, and including coal consumed in the heating mill, is 11 tons a week at 8 shillings 6 pence a ton, and therefore comes out to about 4.5 pounds a week. Gas, 1 pound a week. Oil, etc., 4.5 pounds a week. Total cost to the above auxiliary materials, 10 pounds a week. Therefore, the constant part of the value of the week's product is 378 pounds. Wages amount to 52 pounds a week. The price of the yarn is 12 1/4 pence per pound, which gives, for the value of the 10,000 pounds, the sum of 510 pounds sterling. The surplus value is therefore, in this case, 510 pounds minus 430 being 80 pounds. We put the constant part of the value of the product equal to 0, as it plays no part in the creation of value. There remains 132 pounds as the weekly value created, which equals 52 variable plus 80 pounds surplus. The rate of surplus value is therefore 80 over 52, being 153 and 11/13%. In a working day of 10 hours, with average labor, the result is necessary labor equals 3 and 31 over 33 hours, and surplus labor equals 6 and 2 over 33. One more example. Jacob gives the following calculation for the year 1815. Owing to the previous adjustment of several items, it is very imperfect. Nevertheless, it is sufficient for our purpose. In it, he assumes that the price of wheat is 8 shillings a quarter, and that the average yield per acre is 22 bushels. Here, the assumption is always made that the price of the product is the same as its value, and moreover, surplus value is distributed under the various headings of profit, interest, rent, etc. To us, these headings are irrelevant. We simply add them together, and the sum is a surplus value of £3 11 shillings. The sum of £3 19 shillings paid for seed and manure is constant capital, and we put it equal to 0. There is left the sum of £3 10 shillings, which is the variable capital advanced, and we see that a new value of £3 10 shillings plus £3 11 shillings has been produced in its place. Therefore, S over V is equal to £3 11 shillings over £3 10 shillings, i.e. more than 100%. The worker employs more than half his working day in producing the surplus value, which different persons then share amongst themselves on different pretexts. Section 2. The representation of the value of the product by corresponding proportional parts of the product. Let us now return to the example which showed us how the capitalist converts money into capital. The necessary labor of his spinning worker amounted to 6 hours. Surplus labor was the same. The degree of exploitation of labor was therefore 100%. The product of a working day of 12 hours is 20 pounds of yarn, having a value of 30 shillings. No less than 8/10 of this value, or 24 shillings, is formed by the mere reappearance in it of the value of the means of production, 20 pounds of cotton, valued 20 shillings, and the worn part of the spindle, valued at 4 shillings. In other words, this part consists of constant capital. The remaining 2/10, or 6 shillings, is the new value created during the spinning process. 1/2 of this replaces the value of the day's labor power, or the variable capital. The remaining half constitutes a surplus value of 3 shillings. The total value of the 20 pounds of yarn is thus made up as follows. 30 shillings, being the value of the yarn, is equal to 24 shillings constant, plus 3 shillings variable, plus 3 shillings surplus. Since the whole of this value is contained in the 20 pounds of yarn produced, it follows that the various component parts of this value can be represented as being contained respectively in proportional parts of the product. If the value of 30 shillings is contained in 20 pounds of yarn, then 8/10 of this value, or the 24 shillings that forms its constant part, is contained in 8/10 of the product, or in 16 pounds of yarn. Of the latter, 13 1/3 pounds represent the value of the raw material, the 20 shillings worth of cotton spun, and 2 2/3 pounds represent the 4 shillings worth of spindle, etc. worn away in the process. Hence, the whole of the cotton used up in spinning the 20 pounds of yarn is represented by 13 1/3 pounds of yarn. This latter weight of yarn admittedly contains by weight no more than 13 1/3 pounds of cotton, which is only worth 13 1/3 shillings. But the 6 2/3 shillings additional value contained in it is the equivalent for the cotton consumed in spinning the remaining 6 2/3 pounds of yarn. The effect is the same as if these 6 2/3 pounds of yarn contained no cotton at all, and the whole 20 pounds of cotton were concentrated in the 13 1/3 pounds of yarn. The latter weight, on the other hand, does not contain an atom of the value of the auxiliary materials and instruments of labor, or of the value newly created in the process. In the same way, the 2 2/3 pounds of yarn, in which the 4 shillings, the remainder of the constant capital, is embodied, represent nothing but the value of the auxiliary materials and instruments of labor consumed in producing the 20 pounds of yarn. We have therefore arrived at this result. Although 8/10 of the product, or 16 pounds of yarn, seen in its physical existence as a use value, is just as much the fabric of the spinner's labor as the remainder of the same product, yet, when viewed in this connection, it does not contain and has not absorbed any labor expended during the process of spinning. It is just as if the cotton had converted itself into yarn without any help. It is just as if the shape it had assumed was mere trickery and deceit. In fact, when the capitalist has sold it for 24 shillings, and with the money replaced his means of production, it becomes evident that the 16 pounds of yarn is nothing more than cotton, spindle waste, and coal in disguise. On the other hand, the remaining 2/10 of the product, or 4 pounds of yarn, represent nothing but the new value of 6 shillings created during the 12-hour spinning process. All the value transferred to those 4 pounds from the raw material and instruments of labor consumed was, so to speak, intercepted in order to be incorporated into the 16 pounds first spun. In this case, it is as if the spinner had spun 4 pounds of yarn out of air, or as if he had spun it with the aid of cotton and spindles which were available in nature without human intervention, and therefore transferred no value to the product. Of this 4 pounds of yarn, in which the whole value created in the daily process of spinning is condensed, 1/2 represents the equivalent for the value of the labor consumed, or the 3 shillings of variable capital. The other half represents 3 shillings of surplus value. Since 12 hours of labor put in by the spinner are objectified in 6 shillings, it follows that 60 hours of labor are objectified in yarn of the value of 30 shillings. And this quantity of labor time does in fact exist in the 20 pounds of yarn. For 8/10 of the yarn, or 16 pounds, is a materialization of the 48 hours labor expended before the beginning of the spinning process on means of production. The other 2/10, or 4 pounds, is a materialization of the 12 hours labor expended during the process itself. On a former page, we saw that the value of the yarn is equal to the new value created during the production of that yarn plus the value previously existing in means of production. It has now been shown how the different constituents of the value of the product, distinguished according to their function or according to their concept, may be represented by corresponding proportional parts of the product itself. In this way, the product, i.e. the result of the process of production, is split up into different parts. One part representing only the labor previously spent on the means of production or the constant capital, another part only the necessary labor spent during the process of production or the variable capital, and another, and last part, only the surplus labor expended during the process or the surplus value. The decomposition of the product is as simple a task as it is important. This will be seen later when we apply it to complex and hitherto unsolved problems. So far, we have treated the total product as the final result, ready for use, of a working day of 12 hours. We can, however, also follow this total product through all the stages of its production, and in this way we shall arrive at the same result as before if we represent the partial products, precipitated at different stages, as functionally distinct parts of the final, or total product. The spinner produces 20 pounds of yarn in 12 hours. Hence he produces 1 2/3 pound in 1 hour, and 13 1/3 pound in 8 hours, or a partial product equal in value to all the cotton that is spun in a whole day. Similarly, the partial product of the next period of 1 hour and 36 minutes is 2 2/3 pounds of yarn. This represents the value of the instruments of labor that are consumed in 12 hours. In the following hour and 12 minutes, the spinner produces 2 pounds of yarn worth 3 shillings, a value equal to the whole value he creates in his 6 hours of necessary labor. Finally, in the last hour and 12 minutes, he produces another 2 pounds of yarn, whose value is equal to the surplus value created by his surplus labor in the course of half a day. This method of calculation serves the English manufacturer for everyday use. It shows, he will say, that in the first 8 hours, or 2/3 of the working day, he gets back the value of his cotton, and so on for the remaining hours. It is also a perfectly correct method, since it is in fact the first method given above, only transferred from the spatial sphere, in which the different parts of the completed product lie side by side, to the temporal sphere, in which those parts are produced in succession. But it can also be accompanied by very barbaric notions, especially in the heads of people who are as much interested practically in the valorization process as they are theoretically in misunderstanding it. It may be imagined, for instance, that our spinner produces or replaces, in the first 8 hours of the working day, the value of the cotton. In the following hour and 36 minutes, the value of the deterioration in the instruments of labor. In the next hour and 12 minutes, the value of his wages. And finally, that he devotes only the famous last hour to the production of surplus value for the factory owner. In this way, the spinner is made to perform the twofold miracle not only of producing cotton, spindle, steam engine, coal, oil, etc., at the same time as he is using them to spin, but also of turning one working day of a given level of intensity into 5 similar days. For, in the example we are considering, the production of the raw material and the instruments of labor requires 24 divided by 6 being 4 working days of 12 hours each, and their conversion into yarn requires another such day. That the love of profit induces an easy belief in such miracles, and that there is no lack of sycophantic doctrinaires to prove their existence, is demonstrated by the following famous historical example. Section 3. Senior's Last Hour. One fine morning, in the year 1836, Nassau W. Senior, who may be called the Heinrich Clorin of the English economists, a man famed both for his economic science and his beautiful style, was summoned from Oxford to Manchester to learn in the latter place the political economy he taught in the former. The manufacturers chose him as their prize-fighter, not only against the newly passed Factory Act, but against the 10 hours agitation, which aimed to go beyond it. With their usual practical acuteness, they could realize that the learned professor wanted a good deal of finishing. That is why they invited him to Manchester. For his part, the professor has embodied the lecture he received from the Manchester manufacturers in a pamphlet entitled Letters on the Factory Act, as it affects the cotton manufacturer, published in London, 1837. Here we find, amongst other things, the following edifying passage. Quote, "Under the present law, no mill in which persons under 18 years of age are employed can be worked more than 11.5 hours a day. That is, 12 hours for 5 days in the week and 9 on Saturday. Now the following analysis will show that in a mill so worked, the whole net profit is derived from the last hour. I will suppose a manufacturer to invest £100,000 minus £80,000 in his mill and machinery, and £20,000 in raw material and wages. The annual return of that mill, supposing the capital to be turned once a year and gross profits to be 15%, ought to be goods worth £115,000. Of this £115,000, each of the 23 half hours of work produces 5 115ths, or 1/23rd. Of these 23 23rds, constituting the whole £115,000, 20, that is to say 100,000 out of the 115,000, simply replace the capital. 1/23rd, or 5,000, makes up for the deterioration of the mill and machinery. The remaining 2 23rds, that is the last 2 of the 23 half hours of every day, produce the net profit of 10%. If, therefore, prices remaining the same, the factory could be kept at work 13 hours instead of 11.5, with an addition of about £2,600 to the circulating capital, the net profit would be more than doubled. On the other hand, if the hours of working were reduced by 1 hour per day, prices remaining the same, the net profit would be destroyed. If they were reduced by 1 hour and a half, even the gross profit would be destroyed." End quote. And the professor calls this an analysis. If he believed the outcries of the manufacturers to the effect that the workers spent the best part of the day in the production, i.e. the reproduction or replacement, of the value of the buildings, machinery, cotton, coal, etc., then his analysis was superfluous. His answer could simply have been this: "Gentlemen, if you work your mills for 10 hours instead of 11.5, then other things being equal, the daily consumption of cotton, machinery, etc. will decrease in proportion. You gain just as much as you lose. Your workpeople will in future spend 1 hour and a half less time in reproducing or replacing the capital advanced." If, on the other hand, he did not take them at their word, but, being an expert in such matters, considered it necessary to undertake an analysis, then he ought, in a question which turns exclusively on the relation of the net profit to the length of the working day, above all, to have asked the manufacturers to be careful not to lump together machinery, workshops, raw material, and labor, but to be good enough to place the constant capital, invested in buildings, machinery, raw material, etc., on the one side of the account, and the capital advanced in wages on the other side. If it then turned out that according to the calculations of the manufacturers, the worker reproduced or replaced his wages in 2 half-hours, in that case, he should have continued his analysis as follows. According to your figures, the workman produces his wages in the last hour but one, and your surplus value, or net profit, in the last hour. Now, since in equal periods he produces equal values, the product of the last hour but one must have the same value as that of the last hour. Further, it is only while he works that he produces any value at all, and this quantity of work he does is measured by his labor time. This, you say, amounts to 11.5 hours per day. He employs one portion of these 11.5 hours in producing or replacing his wages, and the remaining portion in producing your net profit. Beyond this, he does absolutely nothing. But since, on your assumption, his wages and the surplus value he provides are of equal value, it is clear that he produces his wages in 5 3/4 hours and your net profit in the other 5 3/4 hours. Again, since the value of the yarn produced in 2 hours is equal to the sum of the value of his wages and of your net profit, the measure of the value of this yarn must be 11.5 working hours, of which 5 3/4 measure the value of the yarn produced in the last hour but one, and the other 5 3/4 the value of the yarn produced in the last hour of all. We now come to such a ticklish point, so watch out. The last working hour but one is, like the first, an ordinary working hour, neither more nor less. How then can the spinner produce in 1 hour, in the shape of the yarn, a value that embodies 5 3/4 hours labor? The truth is that he does not perform any such miracle. The use value produced by him in 1 hour is a definite quantity of yarn. The value of this yarn is measured by 5 3/4 working hours, of which 4 3/4 were, without any assistance from him, previously embodied in the means of production, in the cotton, the machinery, and so on. The remaining 1 hour alone is added by him. Therefore, since his wages are produced in 5 3/4 hours, and the yarn produced in 1 hour also contains 5 3/4 hours work, there is no witchcraft in the result that the value created by his 5 3/4 hours of spinning is equal to the value of the product spun in 1 hour. You are altogether on the wrong track if you think that he loses a single moment of his working day in reproducing or replacing the values of the cotton, the machinery, and so on. On the contrary, it is because his labor converts the cotton and the spindles into yarn, because he spins, that the value of the cotton and spindles go over to the yarn of their own accord. This is a result of the quality of his labor, not its quantity. It is true that he will transfer to the yarn more value, in the shape of cotton, in 1 hour than he will in half an hour, but that is only because in 1 hour he spins up more cotton than in half an hour. You see then that your assertion that the workman produces, in the last hour but one, the value of his wages, and in the last hour your net profit, amounts to no more than this: that in the yarn produced by him in 2 working hours, whether they are the first 2 or the last 2 hours of the working day, there are incorporated 11.5 working hours, i.e. precisely as many hours as there are in his working day. And my assertion that in the first 5 3/4 hours he produces his wages, and in the last 5 3/4 hours your net profit, amounts only to this: that you pay him for the former but not for the latter. In speaking of payment of labor, instead of payment of labor power, I'm only using your own slang expression. Now, gentlemen, if you compare the working time you pay for with the working time you do not pay for, you will find that they are related to each other as half a day is to half a day. This gives a rate of 100%, and a very pretty percentage it is. Further, there is not the least doubt that if you make your hands toil for 13 hours instead of 11.5, and as may be expected from you, if you treat the work done in that extra 1 hour and a half as pure surplus labor, then the latter will be increased from 5 3/4 hours labor to 7 1/4 hours labor, and the rate of surplus value will go up from 100% to 126 2/23%. So that you are altogether too sanguine in expecting that by such an addition of 1.5 hours to the working day the rate will rise from 100% to 200% and more. In other words, that it will be more than doubled. On the other hand, the heart of a man is a wonderful thing, especially when it is carried in his wallet. You take too pessimistic a view when you fear that a reduction of the hours of labor from 11.5 to 10 will sweep away the whole of your net profit. Not at all. All other conditions remaining the same, the surplus labor will fall from 5 3/4 hours to 4 3/4 hours, a period that still gives a very profitable rate of surplus value, namely 82 14/23%. But this fateful last hour, about which you've invented more stories than the millenarians about the Day of Judgment, is all bosh. If it goes, it will not cost you your pure hands, nor will it cost the boys and girls you employ their pure minds. Whenever your last hour strikes in earnest, think of the Oxford professor. And now, gentlemen, farewell, and may we meet again in a better world, but not before. The battle cry of the last hour, invented by Senior in 1836, was raised once again in the London Economist of the 15th of April 1848 by James Wilson, an economic mandarin of high standing, in a polemic against the 10 Hours Bill. Section 4. The surplus product. We call the portion of the product that represents surplus value, i.e. 1/10 of the 20 pounds or 2 pounds of yarn in the example given above, by the name of surplus product. Just as the rate of surplus value is determined by its relation not to the sum total of the capital, but to its variable part, in the same way, the relative amount of surplus product is determined by its ratio not to the remaining part of the total product, but to that part of it in which necessary labor is incorporated. Since the production of surplus value is the determining purpose of capitalist production, the size of a given quantity of wealth must be measured not by the absolute quantity produced, but by the relative magnitude of the surplus product. The sum of the necessary labor and the surplus labor, i.e. the sum of the periods of time during which the worker respectively replaces the value of his labor power and produces the surplus value, constitutes the absolute extent of his labor time, i.e. the working day.